Today is our second week in a series of worship services designed to help us think about how we might hit the reset button on how we see God, the Bible, and our faith. I set up our journey during last week's sermon, and if you missed it, I encourage you to visit our website and watch it so that you have the details. But let me just give you a little recap. Here are the things that we talked about. The faith we were taught as children often does not meet the realities of adulthood. Simply put, our childhood faith was likely pretty simple, which was okay for that point in our lives. But as we get older, life gets more complicated, and sometimes the simple faith of our childhood doesn't meet our needs or answer the deeper questions and harder realities adult life can bring. So a gap forms between the faith we had as children and the faith we need as adults. Here's another thing we talked about. The Bible was never meant to be the starting point for our faith. Now, I'm not saying the Bible isn't important. It is. And as part of our faith, we should read and study it. But it was not meant to be the starting point. How do we know that? Because for the first few hundred years of our faith, there was no Bible. Yet Christianity grew like wildfire. Why? Because they had the right starting point, one that was founded in the question, who is Jesus? For Christians, or anyone exploring Christianity, this is where it all starts. The problem is that if we don't have an accurate picture of who Jesus was or what he taught, then we are building our faith on the wrong foundation. And unfortunately, that happens more than we might realize. Sometimes, even with all the right intentions, we get the message of Jesus all wrong. And in so doing, instead of giving ourselves and others a great starting point for faith, we get off on the wrong track. Our topic for today is a perfect example of what I mean. So let's dive in. I want to begin with a word we've likely all heard before: sin. It's a tough word. One that carries all kinds of meanings and causes all kinds of feelings. It can make us feel guilty, shameful, hopeless, and even condemned. We really don't like the word sin, especially if we have to associate ourselves with the full reality of what that word means. So while we often throw around the phrase, everyone's a sinner, when we have to confront the reality of what that means for our own lives, we like to soften things a bit. So we often substitute another word, an easier word. A word that leaves us all kinds of wiggle room, and while this word is easier for some people to say than others, it always sounds a lot better than sin. That word is mistake. Have you ever made a mistake? Of course you've made mistakes. In fact, it would be weird if you said anything other than yes to that question. We all make mistakes. But let's be clear about what mistakes are. Mistakes are things that happen in spite of our best efforts. We don't mean to make mistakes, and we are normally doing everything we can to avoid them. Now, don't get me wrong, mistakes can cause all kinds of trouble in our lives, and some mistakes are bigger than others. But mistakes are typically unforeseen and happen in spite of our trying to avoid them. The problem is that we often use the word mistake in ways that go well beyond what it means. For example, have you ever seen an athlete, celebrity, or politician stand in front of a microphone and say something like, "I've made a mistake"? I know what they are trying to say, but that kind of confession often falls short. After all, is repeatedly taking performance-enhancing drugs in order to gain a competitive advantage a mistake? What about an ongoing extramarital affair? What about secrets, lies, and behaviors that were not just one-time mistakes, but ongoing practices? The reality is that sometimes we make mistakes on purpose. Sometimes we even plan our mistakes with great care in hope we won't get caught. Some of us even repeat the same mistake over and over again. And here's the thing. When we are in the midst of doing these things, we know they are not mere mistakes. We know we are doing something wrong, and we are most likely not calling them mistakes while we are doing them. But if we get caught, we tend to say, I've made a terrible mistake. Here are some basic rules when it comes to mistakes. If you know it is wrong before you do it, it is not a mistake. If you plan to do something wrong, it is not a mistake. If you repeatedly do something you know is wrong, it is not a mistake. Jesus had another word for these mistakes. Any guesses? That's right. Sin. Jesus made a big deal out of sins, a really big deal. But here's the thing. The way Jesus dealt with sin is likely very different than the way many of us were taught and the way a whole lot of Christians deal with sin today. We need a new starting point for how we talk about and deal with the word sin and what it stands for, and that starting point is found in the following reality. Jesus' purpose in focusing on sin was not about condemnation and exclusion. It was about hope and restoration. Let me say that again. Jesus' purpose in focusing on sin was never about condemnation and exclusion, but about hope and restoration. For Jesus, forgiving sins was about restoring broken relationship, about bridging the gap that separates us from each other and from God. When Jesus talked about sin, he wasn't trying to keep people out, he was trying to draw them in. This is so important. When we talk about sins, we usually do so in a very condemnatory way. Some people hold up signs on street corners or post things on social media condemning what they believe are sins as well as those who commit them. Some people just whisper their disapproval, which is quieter, but no less damaging. And of course, there are some churches that won't allow people to fully participate or to receive communion because of how they approach the topic of sin. When it comes to sins and those who commit them, we often want to distance ourselves from the sinner as much as possible, to keep them at a distance and make sure people know that while we might not be perfect, at least we're not like them. But Jesus had a very different take. For him, sin was a reality that was common to all. No one stood in a state of any more or less guilt than anyone else. His purpose in pointing out that fact was not to condemn people, but to bring them to a place where they are ready to have their relationship with God restored. Now, how Jesus got people to that place, how he still gets us to that place where we are ready to have our relationship with God restored, it might surprise you. It might even challenge you a little bit. You see, when Jesus talked about sin, he did so in almost the exact opposite way that we do. Instead of dumbing down sin in a way that allows for equating it with mistakes, Jesus raised the bar on sin to a point where no one could reach it. Take a look at this passage. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. These words would have been very challenging for their original audience. The scribes and Pharisees were like professional good people. They sought to be perfect and were seen as more perfect than anyone else. If you had to be better than them, who could do that? Jesus presses even further. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. Do you see how he is raising the bar? You might not have murdered anyone, but I bet you've been angry with someone before. And if so, then you are just as guilty of sin as a murderer. Let me give you one more example. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Don't just pat yourself on the back because you've never committed adultery. If you so much as look at another person lustfully outside of your marriage or committed relationship, you are just as guilty. Jesus goes on a bit more through Matthew 5, basically making it impossible for anyone not to be included in the category of sinner. When people heard these things, they were freaking out. If all of this was true, then who could be saved? If this was true, were they not all doomed to be condemned? That's when Jesus had them right where he wanted them. Yes, they were all doomed to condemnation by sin through the law. No doubt about that. But Jesus wasn't telling them this to fill them with shame or guilt or so they would be excluded from something. Jesus was telling them this so that they would know they had hope. Look at these words from the Gospel of John. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Our faith is not one of condemnation, and those who make it about that are getting it all wrong. That's not how this works, and that is not what Jesus taught. For example, there's a story told in the Bible about a woman who was caught in adultery. She was guilty. Not even she denied that. The law said she should be stoned. The community was ready to condemn her to death because of her sin. But after challenging the crowd about their own sins, Jesus turned to her and said, "I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more." Over and over again in the Gospels, people who thought they were more perfect than others were pointing out the sins of others and then using those sins to condemn people to a life outside of the community and the life that could be found in the community. And over again, Jesus went to the people who were condemned by the righteous and offered them grace and restoration. I understand what a fine line this is and why it is so easy to get confused. Yes, sin does keep us from having a full relationship with God, but sin is not the end of the story. In fact, for Jesus, the recognition of sin is the means to an end. In order to truly accept the grace we have in Jesus Christ, we must first confess that we are sinners. I know that sounds like an uncomfortable, judgy, and churchy word, but it is an important one. And if we avoid that word, or try to tone down its impact in our life, or deny that it describes us, we are missing out on the fullness of grace that is waiting for us. This is what the whole story of Christ is about. And in order for the grace of God to embrace us, we have to admit that we need it. There is no shame in this. There is no need to be shy about this. Jesus never shamed anyone who was a sinner. You know who he did shame? Those who made it a practice to point out the sins of others. He shamed those who used religion to keep the broken exiled instead of bringing them hope and bringing them home. He shamed those who denied their own sin. All too often, the modern church and those who call themselves Christian have a tendency to use the concept of sin to try and condemn others, convincing them that they need to change their ways and be made right with God. Unfortunately, even when done with the best of intentions, this usually comes across in ways that cause others to experience shame and feel like they aren't good enough for God's love. But that is not the model of Jesus. In fact, he condemns that model over and over again. Instead, Jesus talks about sin in a way that leads to healing, hope, and reconciliation. Instead of standing on street corners, Jesus would cross a street. Instead of angrily condemning others, Jesus would say, I do not condemn. Instead of saying, you have no place here, Jesus would say, this is the only place that you can find life. We are called to do the same. Not only because it is the right thing to do for others, but it is also the only thing that will save us as well. The reason Jesus spoke so strongly about sin was so that everyone would understand that when it comes to sin, no one is better than anyone else. But to get to the place where Jesus is calling us when it comes to all this, we have to confess that we don't just make mistakes. We also sin. And sometimes we do so knowingly, willingly, and on purpose. So let me end by asking you a really important question. Have you ever sinned? Me too. The good news is that because of that confession, we are not condemned. In fact, according to Jesus, it is the starting point of our salvation. Amen.